Hello everyone, today we conclude our double episode about the 100 Years War Free Companies. As we've seen the last time, we ended comprehending different companies that operated also in other regions of Europe, thus illustrating their military curriculum as far as those areas are concerned. We'll keep doing this today as well. We, for this reason, haven't given more importance to, say, more relevant companies just per se, like the white one, for example. They will surely make multiple videos just on it. Today we will, however, for example, briefly summarize John Hawkwood's curriculum, as we will mostly listing, especially at the end, different free company commanders and their military exploit, just to give an idea of what these people, more famous or more obscure, were about, especially in such French theater that, as you know, was essentially the most devastated by the same free companies. All the introduction has been given in the other video, so we will simply continue. We left by looking at the organization of the free companies that over time acquired an ever more structured internal system, administration, control, capacity, etc. As we have appreciated essentially how each company functioned as a small autonomous unit, especially in France, where free companies were more numerous as smaller, as they were more fragmented, as the power vacuum at some point left in some provinces after major crisis of the French monarchy allowed for literally different war bands to parcel out the territory for each of them, where they would lord over the local populace. In other theaters, the situation is really different, right? Italy is naturally the place where the free companies acquired a more robust physiognomy, also because they were in fact less free and were more properly at the service of this and that power, regardless of the very autonomous activity that they carried out. We've seen how essentially there is a timing in this, the peak of the free companies in terms properly of individual freedom, so to say, are the 50s, the 60s of the 14th century. After that, there is an increasing control from the various polities on such mini armies that began also to grow in size. The other day we talked about, for example, the condottieri, but also the compagnie d'ordonnance, so how fundamentally free companies, that was the title of the video as a matter of fact, were gradually framed within a sort of more permanent system, right? Mostly from a statal institution. That's how literally these, the so-called permanent armies were created, right? And so it's actually nothing strange. We've already seen in the first video how essentially the company had always been there ever since the 13th century. When we talk about armies in general, these are the hairs of the war bands, right? Even to go more back in time. And it was just the regular military, let's say, form of military organization. So what is specific at this point of the free companies is the level of autonomy from authority that follows the Black Death crisis. And eventually these systems are reabsorbed at large, and also by systems that had always maintained, of course, their own armies and their companies, so to say, in a much more stringent way, even when we're talking properly about mercenaries, because that's the other big chapter that we haven't discussed, and that I think historiography hasn't properly focused too much on. That is to say, we got a bit too fascinated in a way about these sort of free, that's the adjective that catches the attention, like so mercenary commanders went out there, they did whatever they wanted, but at the end of the day, they quite didn't, but there are lots of other companies that we can partly even reconstruct the history of that was under this or that power that actually fared pretty well. They were very effective, very good, and that we sort of don't study, or we haven't historiographically focused so much on, because they were obedient and they simply did the same job, by the way, that these other guys did in a strictly military sense. In any case, there was also an autonomy in the capacity of uniting, right? Some companies itself, as we've seen, were put together just for significant ventures were necessary. Other times you would have other companies. We've seen the one of the bastards during especially the French participation in the War of Castilian Succession, and more that were grouped like they could form like entire battle lines, for example. So I will not digress also on the tactical dimensions of this that we will see in other videos, and that effectively followed like the one of all the other armies of the time. So that's why it's not special in that sense. But at the same time, it's substantially important that they operated still as the norm, and that norm should never be forgotten or put behind these other nothing, actually, because the practice, as we just said, was the same. Now, in 1387, Perrot de Bernois, who was the captain of Chalusset, gathered 400 lances from up to 7 different Routier garrisons to launch a raid on Montferrand in Auvergne. This is a typical context. Different routers, literally, that were, again, like low soldiery, used in this case just for garrisons, decided to unite because they realized that this area in central southern France was basically left on its own. These were areas that were typically targeted by the English chevauchés, and they put together this force of 400 men-at-arms plus retinue to carry out this venture. As we said before, we will stop at every name in the line to explain who these people were. In fact, Perrot de Bernois, sometimes spelled Perrot de Bernois, by the way, was a Gascon mercenary. We've never fully made a video about Gascon warfare per se. We talk about Gascon, etc., but this is also so typical, especially from the English side, having more Gascon than English forces carrying out these raids, and just even when the English weren't there, because they weren't quite active, like they would operate by themselves. So Perrot was mercenary captain during the 100 Years' War, a figure emblematic of this turbulent late 14th century when the free companies roamed France, known as the governor of Chalusset, a formidable castle in the Limousin region near Limoges. He was a pro-English routier, a soldier, or routier if you prefer, a soldier of fortune who thrived in the chaos following the Treaty of Bretigny, as we've seen is a bit like the one triggering the whole thing. I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers that explains you from a quite graphic tactical point of view why that had been the case. These are the years of the Jacquerie. John II, King of France, had been captured in battle, brought to England. France had to pay an astronomical ransom for him that would anyway die in London in captivity. And so Perrot is protagonist in this context, and also in the following truces. His name, Le Bernois, ties him to Béarn, a region in southwestern France near Gascony, suggesting he hailed from that rugged, independent-minded area. I made a video about the Bidouar, the Bidot, that explains a bit some of the most sort of characteristic traits of such southwestern French populations, why they were out there as mercenaries on a regular basis. Perrot's career took off in the 70s and the 80s of the 14th century, a time when peace agreements left many fighters like Sir Robert Knowles or Basco de Moleon that we've seen in the previous video, unemployed and itching for action. Unlike some of his peers, Perrot leaned into discipline when it suited him. Froissart, that, as you know, I also made a video about, notes that during a truce in the late 80s, likely tied to negotiations between Richard II and Charles VI, Perrot and his garrison at Chalusset stuck to the terms, refusing to raid despite the temptation. This restraint irked rogue captains like Amerigo Marcel, a fellow routier who ignored the truce to plunder between Clermont and Montferrand. Perrot's men, loyal to the captain's orders, were reportedly furious at Marcel's defiance, which risked French retaliation against all free companies. Chalusset-Perrot's stronghold was no backwater fort. It was a strategic beast perched on a rocky spur, controlling the Limousin countryside. From there he launched raids and held sway over nearby castles like Saint-Jean-Ligure and Chalus-Chabrol, which he seized in 1381 and kept until 1393. His reach stretched towards Auvergne, where he took Saint-Exupéry-le-Roche as a staging point, relying on a Routier, brigand, and pro-English lords. Limoges felt his shadow. The city's burghers fretted as he squeezed the region, extorting patis that were this basically alternative to plunder, or in fact outright looting when payments lacked. By 1393, John I, Duke of Berry, and Limoges cut a deal with him to relinquish Chalus-Chabrol, proof he'd grown too big to ignore. Perrot's story intersects with the broader war. He operated in a world Bertrand du Guesclin that we've seen the other time, you surely are aware of, had tried to tame, exporting troublemakers to Spain in the 60s of the 14th century. But Perrot emerged later, dodging such schemes. Unlike Knowles, who led large-scale chevauchée for England, or Fra Mauriale, who ran a mercenary empire in Italy, let's not exaggerate, but still enormous, if anything, astronomic ciphers that passed through his hands, Perrot kept a tighter regional grip, balancing loyalty to England with practical self-interest. His adherences to truces when he chose to suggests a shrewdness missing in wilder captains like Marcel, who ended up executed in 1391 after the Viscount de Meaux crushed his rebellion. Details on Perrot's origins are and end as well are thin. He was likely of the petite noblesse, or a bastard son, common for routier leaders, driven by the need to make his own name. After 1393, he fades from records. He might have retired on his gains or met a quiet end. Unlike the dramatic exits of peers, Chalusset fell to the French forces by 1406, signaling the Routiers' waning power in Limousin. Perrot de Bernois stands out as a survivor who played the game smart, ruthless when it paid, restrained when it didn't, leaving a mark on a war that often forgot its smaller players like him. Notably, Froissart remarked that when assembling at Donzac, Perrot de Bernois arrived first to demonstrate that he was the leader of the expedition, highlighting the lack of respect for authority among his associates. On a broader scale, such gatherings of companions could lead to the establishment of Grandes Compagnies, as they were called, big companies, as exemplified by the Grand Company, which consisted of 16,000 members and caused significant destruction in the Saône and Rhône valleys during the early 1360s. This is a very interesting story that shows you, by the way, how, of course, the most peripheral, but not the least rich parts of France were ravaged at this point. Remember that the entire trade routes in Europe were being redrawn because of the engulfment effect of the Rhône Valley, and so the connection between northern France and the Mediterranean were basically being ravaged by these routiers. So that, I don't know, the Genoese opened the Atlantic route, the Venetians the Bavarian one, and these areas lost importance as a consequence in southern France. But the Grand Company is quite interesting because, as we've seen, most of these forces were normally smaller, right? The Grand Company formed around 1361. So here we're talking, by the way, France, because there's also the Grand Company of Italy that we've seen in the last video. So this depends also on the national histories of these places. This had formed in 61-62 likely an amalgamation of smaller bands like the Tardvenus, the late-comers, which had been harassing France since 1360. As you've seen, is the Treaty of Bretigny. All people who had remained unemployed after the war. Leaders weren't always named, unlike Basco de Montléon or Sir Robert Knowles, that, as we've seen, were so famous. But figures like Seguin de Badefol, a Gascon captain, and Arnaud de Serval, the archpriest, we'll see later, are linked to its early days. These routiers weren't loyal to any crown. Their allegiance was to profit and survival. Hence, paradoxically, why there were so many at a given place, so distant from any major monarchic concentration or reach. All right, they could have not simply operated in other areas in the same way. The Grand Company's rampage through the Saône and Rhône valleys stretching from Burgundy to Provence was a nightmare for locals. Starting in late 1361, they surged east from central France, targeting fertile, trade-rich regions. The Saône and Rhône rivers were lifelines for commerce, dotted with towns like Mahon, Chalon-sur-Saône, and Lyon, which made them ripe for extortion. The company didn't just raid, they occupied. They seized castles, extorted patis, so we've seen the protection payments, and burned what wouldn't pay. Jean de Venette writes of them stripped in the countryside bare, while Froissart claims they lived better than kings off the loot. With some exaggeration, but up to a certain point. Consider that all these numbers are big because we're talking lots of also not particularly efficient troops in general, but just the mass of them in areas that had remained abandoned without effective overlordship, couldn't do much against. The Grand Company peak infamy came in 1362, culminating at the Battle of Brignais on April the 6th. Near Lyon, the Grand Company, possibly led by Seguin de Badefol and reinforced by men like Basco de Montléon, ambushed a royal army sent by King John II to crush them. This wasn't a rabble. They used terrain as surprise, smashing a force of knights under Jacques de Bourbon and a young Bertrand de Guesclin. The defeat stunned France, proving these brigands could outfight nobles. Remember that there had been lots of episodes in the first half of the 14th century in which rapidly inferior forces had literally kept at bay, even defeated cavalry. So this battle was a bit more composite. These weren't just infantrymen or whatever. So they were, as we've seen, relatively competent people, especially under the right leaders. And as a consequence of this royal defeat, Lyon itself narrowly escaped, paying a hefty ransom to avoid sack, because in many ways the problem was always the same. Like if you paid, at least they would go away. Like besieging a major city, especially like Lyon, would have been sort of more complicated. I made a video, by the way, about these regions. We talk about the Dauphiné in particular, and we've seen there the relation with Lyon, etc. So if you search for them, you will find some interesting reference of why also this area was so a bit abandoned to itself, and also why, by the way, this was really technically not even France at large. In some areas, we're talking here the Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire was not around, and French had already sort of began to protect some of these populations. That 16,000 figure, cited by chroniclers, likely includes, as we're saying, fighters and followers, wives, servants, scavengers, but even half that number was colossal for a freelance outfit. They weren't a disciplined legion like Chandos' squadrons at Nadjara. They were a swarm splitting into smaller bands to ravage wider areas, then regrouping for big scores. By 1363, they torched parts of the Rhône Valley and pushed towards Avignon, where Pope Innocent VI excommunicated them and hired mercenaries to fend them off. Which is like a bitter irony, which tells you how, even in times of crisis, of course, the bigger powers like the papacy could afford an adequate defense against these forces, especially when they were entrenched, places like Avignon. We'll talk more about the Avignonese papacy, because I think we've never really talked about even just the context of this curial resettlement so to say. Now, the Grand Company destructiveness wasn't just physical. They deepened France's post-treaty woes, undermining John II's fragile ransom negotiations. That, at large, why this mess happens, because France is in deep trouble after this massive defeat and dramatic power shrinking. So you see, everything is always explained. Nothing is really random, right? Consider, as we said before, John was still captive in England until 1364, and as we just said, like, the English even allowed him to rule, right, at a distance, because, chivalry, nobility, royalty, it was understood that there was a duty there to still be able to be performed. The English had also their own interest for some of these machinations to go on. In any case, on the ground, villages emptied, trade stalled, and nobles lost control as peasants fled or fought back. It was a social unraveling, with the company as both symptom and cause. The Grand Company's spray couldn't last, however. This is really typical of such enterprises. By 1365, Charles V, crowned after John II's death, tasked Bertrand du Guesclin with taming the Routiers. Du Guesclin, blooded at Brignais, knew they couldn't be beaten head-on. Instead, he co-opted them, luring thousands, including some Grand Company remnants, with promises of loot in Spain. He marched them to Castile to back Henry of Trastamara against Peter the Cruel, a campaign that bled off their numbers through battles like Montiel. 1369, those who stayed in France faced stiffer resistance as nobles forfeited towns and hired their own mercenaries. This Grand Company wasn't a single tidy entity like Monreale's Italian outfit. It was a hydra, like a loose alliance of war bands that peaked in the Saint-Rhône rampage. It lacked the named charisma of a Knowles or Perrot de Bernois, but its scale dwarfed most peers. It showed how Bretigny's peace birthed a war of its own. One fought not for banners but bread. By shattering the illusion of royal control, it forced France to rethink her strategy, paving the way for du Guesclin's cunning over brute force. In the end, the Grand Company was less a group than a moment when the war's leftovers turned the table on their masters. It's evident how, of course, even just from a political and moral sense, these groups were essentially just temporary coalitions without a unified organization or acknowledged leader, as each company retained its individual identity and followed its own captain. We have observed how literally the company is fundamentally the ancestor, the same unit of today's company in a broader tactical sense. So great part of the commander's connection with this larger scale, sort of commanded from the field tactical unit is truly like we still have, like in all armies today. And that had existed since previous time. I mean, the maniple had been the same thing, etc. Naturally, it's interesting to see how these things apparently evolve in the art of war, but it's as if they were just a core and then just bigger conglomerations at some point for different reasons could be organized. Now, that said, certain captains did manage to assert dominance over others, converting them into their lieutenants, for example. This was obvious because the companies were not of the same size, right? And the bigger ones, the most successful, the most experienced, held sway. So while it was difficult to create particularly big forces at large, there was an internal hierarchy within the same broader forces. For example, in 1362, Seguin de Badefol was declared quote, a sovereign captain among the companies and proclaimed himself literally king of the companions. While in the 1380s, Geoffroy Tête Noire, so Geoffrey Blackhead, styled himself, quote, sovereign lord of all captains of Auvergne, Rouergue, and Limousin. You understand here always the same heirs, the ones that escaped control of the northern French monarchy. in Occitania. So these two figures are very interesting. Now, Seguin de Badefol, born circa 1330, died 1366, was a Gascon, again, Routier, a mercenary captain from Périgord, born at the castle of Badefol to Seguin Gontaut de Badefol and Marguerite de Bernois. Nicknamed Chopin, possibly the lame. It has nothing to do with Chopin, which is the actually correct Polish name of the famous Chopin. There's another story, but here the etymology is possibly the lame, right? We don't know too well about, sort of medieval dialects at some point, probably from a physical quirk. He was a product of war's underbelly. He fought at Poitiers in 1356. Again, I have a pretty long video exhaustively explaining the tactics of that battle. He fought for the English, that, as we've seen, had mostly Gascon forces in their army than Englishmen, under the Black Prince, alongside men like Basco de Montleon. After the Treaty of Bretigny, idle soldiers Seguin didn't retire. He turned predator, leading the Tarvenus, latecomers, a free company swelling to 2,000-3,000 men. He pillaged Languedoc, Roussillon, and Toulouse. Here we are in the far southwest on the Mediterranean in 1361 with Berthucat d'Albret. In 1362, he joined the Grand Company's rout at Brignais, smashing Jacques de Bourbon's royal army, a victory that humiliated France and emboldened the Routiers, as we've seen. By 1363, Seguin spurned Italy-bound peers, doubling down on plunder. He sacked Brude, ravaged Auvergne, and in 1364 seized 60 castles along the Saône and Rhône, including Anne. This tells you, by the way, how powerful they really could become when they managed to hold control over this massively fortified systems. Pope Urban V, desperate, at that point paid him 40,000 florins to leave, holding his family hostage in Avignon for good measure, then excommunicated him. 40,000 florins was fairly a lot. I mean, the papacy was just handling this money without too much need to try to save them. Like, so in general, the upper hand the papacy had when they captured Seguin's family. That's the reason why he retreated to Gascony, then Navarre, chasing unpaid wages from Charles the Bad. They will talk about, in our series about medieval Navarre, we talked about him a bit in the video about the Duchy of Burgundy. There, in Navarre, in 1366, Charles poisoned the same Seguin with figs. That's how your peers, per some accounts, by the way, that's how you get rid of a free company at times. At Pamplona or Falches, an ignoble end for a man would lived by the sword. Because, let's stress, as we've seen also in previous videos, and notoriously so, and we were discussing just the other day, like, these company commanders at large were all noblemen of some kind, and they would remain in that aforementioned army organization over the centuries, that very thing. This is true also for the French army up to the Revolution, etc. So just they were the guys who knew how to do it, right? Having said this, Seguin wasn't a noble crusader like Chandos or a patriot like de Guesclin. He was a war profiteer thriving where order broke down, like most of these guys. Whereas Geoffroy Tête Noire is murkier, like less a household name or a shadow in the chronicles, likely a Breton or Gascon captain. His name suggests a dark reputation or appearance. He emerges in the 60s, 70s of the 14th century, tied to the free companies plaguing France after Bretigny. Froissart mentions a Geoffroy Tête Noire among Routier in the Limousin and Auvergne, possibly linked to Perrot de Bernois' crew, or the Tarvenus. He is credited with holding castles like Ventadour or Nontron, extorting patties from terrified locals. Some tie him to de Guesclin in 1365, pushed to redirect Routiers to Spain. Though evidence is thin, he may have been too stubborn or minor to join that exodus. Right, and as a consequence, Tête Noir's obscurity makes him a foil to flashier captains. He didn't lead grand battles or die dramatically. He was a cog in the lawless machine, a local terror whose deeds blurred into the broader Routier scourge. If Seguin was a kingpin, Geoffroy was a foot soldier with a mean streak, less documented, but no less brutal, by the way. In the 14th century, the Free Company's main regular patrons included, as we've just seen here, for example, the King of Navarre, the rival Dukes of Brittany, and the Counts of Foix and Armagnac, the latter giving rise to the nickname the Armagnac for Routier, by the way, and tying, as you know, into the basically to the royal faction in France against the Bourguignons, the Burgundians, that were tendentially allied with the French. And as we've seen, in fact, these companies, aside from their general autonomy, did side with either one party or the other. At the Battle of Cocherel, that we will see in detail in some other video, in 1364, up to 2/3 of the French forces and 5/6 of the Navarrese army were composed of free companies. This really gives you a pretty neat political background to the military situation. You know, just by the composition of the army, what was going on in France at that point. The Battle of Cocherel was fought in Normandy near the Eure River and pitted Charles V of France against Charles II of Navarre the Bad over Burgundy's succession, because these were the years in which technically very interesting things, including even a bigger Burgundy than the one that happened later, could emerge. Bertrand du Guesclin led the French, Bretons, Gascons, and Burgundians, some 1,500 to 2,000 strong, against Jean de Grilly, the Capital de Bouc, that we have seen at Battle of Poitiers, commanding from 1,200 to 1,500 Navarrese, English, and Gascon troops, including Joel's archers. Navarre allied with England despite Bretigny's truce, and so to exploit John II's captivity and the Dauphin's weakness. For 2 days, both sides glared from fortified hills, the capital atop the Bois de la Ronce, du Guesclin below. On May the 16th, the capital attacked, lured by a French feint. His charge faltered. Du Guesclin's men wheeled around, hammering the Navarrese with flanking assaults. Joel fought heroically, but fell, wounded and captured. The capital was taken alive. The French lost their crossbow master, but the Navarrese were routed. Few escaped death or capture. Cocherel was no grand spectacle like Poitiers indeed, but it solidified Charles V's grip and showcased du Guesclin's grit over chivalric flair. It also checked Navarre's ambitions, nudging England's proxies back, a small win with big ripples. Other important battle is the one of Auray, that again we will describe at some point, fought on the same year of Cocherel, where 4/5 of the Anglo-Bretons and half of the Franco-Bretons were members of these compagnies, right? These are other names that you could find. Auray in Brittany was the climax of the Breton War of Succession. 100 Years' War sideshow. We'll really need to get a bit more in depth into the 100 Years' War, because we never made too many videos about it. Now, Charles of Blois, French-backed, faced John de Montfort, was English-backed, for the duchy. Du Guesclin, fresh from Cocherel, led Blois 3,000 to 4,000 Breton French troops against John Chandos and Montfort's 2,000 to 2,500 Anglo-Bretons. Montfort's side had the edge, seasoned knights, longbowmen, and unity, more than else. At Auray's Salt Flats, Blois' army charged head down, ignoring du Guesclin's caution. Chandos' archers shredded their ranks, and Montfort's knights encircled them. Du Guesclin fought to the end, captured, his axe buried in foes, but Blois was killed, his head bashed in. The rout was total. Montfort claimed Brittany, sealed by the 1365 Treaty of Guérande. Auray was Chandos' masterpiece and Du Guesclin's rare flop, proving English tactics still ruled open fields. It locked Brittany into England's orbit, a thorn French side for 4 years. Also in this case, you've seen how prominent the free companies were, organically wise. In 1365, Du Guesclin raised approximately 10 to 12,000 men from the free companies for Henry of Trastamara's campaign in Castile. As we've seen, many of these guys had previously fought against the same French. The following year, the Black Prince recruited 12,000 companions for his own expedition as well, as reported by Froissart. So you realize, also in this case, that even in the moment of, or just after the moment of greatest drama, 9 years later, France and England could already mobilize significantly large-scale forces, considering also the general international strains on economy, etc., against one another. So de facto repolarizing, or at least, reordering in part this much more fragmented picture. And that's the kind of pattern, right? There are moments of sort of swing between, say, war and truces. And following the 90s of the 14th century, the companies, in fact, seem to have vanished, at least until hostilities reignited under Henry V in the following century, leading to a revival, albeit on a smaller scale. Monstrelet notes that after 1437, they came to be known as écorcheurs, or skinners, due to their practice of stealing even the shirts from their victims. Or worse, because at the end of the day, lots of people were tortured to death, surely even skinned alive. But it was in general like, the idea of scorched earth, locusts, effects of these soldiers' passage. Monstrelet comments, quote, "This term became popular for an extended period, eventually leading to the obsolescence of the name Armagnac, which had persisted for so long." It's like, I don't know, X trends today. Like, at some point, people change mindset in just conventional ways, even though things do not change too much in substance. Monstrelet again mentions the Castilian mercenary Rodrigo de Villandrando, who served the French and was described as, quote, "the foremost among them, commanding over 600 cavalry." It wasn't bad. So this was a Spanish écorcheur in France. Let's talk about him. Rodrigo de Villandrando, born roughly 1385, died 1448, so this is another generation, you understand, was a Castilian routier who crossed into France, becoming a terror in the war's later phases. Born near Valladolid to a Biscayan family, though he joined Amaury de Sévérac's company by 1422, fighting at Vernouilles. Beautiful battle. I studied it many years ago, and I hope to make a video soon about it. We're in 1424. Post-treaty chaos suited him. By 1427, he was pillaging Languedoc, Carcassonne, and Lyon with his écorcheurs, the brutal free company swelling to 10,000. In 1433, he married Marguerite de Bourbon. Right, I made a video about the Bourbons. This tied Rodrigo to the French nobility, yet kept ravaging Villemura in 1439, Comminges, Toulouse. All felt his wrath. Charles VII harnessed him in the 30s of the 15th century against Burgundy and England. I made multiple videos about Charles VII, including, in fact, the Compagnie policy. Charles knighted Rodrigo in 1440. By 1442, he hit Gascony, seizing Dax and Saint-Sever from the English. Rich and titled at this point as the Count of Ribadeo, Rodrigo retreated to Valladolid around 1445, dying by 1448. He wasn't a strategist like Chandos or a fixer like du Guesclin. He was a mortier who flipped war's scraps into a fortune, a latecomer thriving where Seguin and Tête Noire once had roamed. The term Armagnac, by the way, did not disappear even after the Écorcheur one was introduced. It was in fact used to refer to the estimated 4,000 routiers rendered surplus due to the Truce of Tours, who were dispatched to support Emperor Frederick III in 1444. We're pretty late in time. This may be just the last chapter of the Free Companies in a sense, even though, as we explained countless times, this sort of phenomena did continue at different levels. We've seen it even in the series about the German Peasants' War, as a matter of fact. Now, the Swiss, while looking at the aforementioned forces arriving in Germany, mockingly referred to them as from the French Armagnac, with the German consonants to Armejacken, that can be translated to poor jacks or poor fools in some way. That in part was also the way many of these troops would have actually looked like. Machiavelli said, by the way, that the Swiss looked like garbage, at least compared to the Landsknechten. We are a bit later in time, but I made a video about Swiss military dress and so the Landsknechten one. There was objectively a difference. It was a specific reason for that, a deeply political and cultural one. In any case, this was just a way to say, okay, well, these are actually some scumbags here, 40,000. No, they were just a rebel sent there, where, of course, with a core, as we've seen before, of effectively fighting force, but again, nothing to be excessively relied upon as professional troops at large. And this was a time, we were in the mid-15th century, which way more substantial semi-permanent forces were now being fielded in consistent fashion. I made multiple videos about this. You can check out the 15th century playlist. I will at some point make century warfare playlist enumeration, so to make it easier in any case. Apart from now all these figures we've mentioned in the two videos, there are so many others that here we will make an effort to describe. Other notable captains of free companies in the 14th century. Sir John Emery was an English knight who carved a bloody niche among the free companies, often riding alongside Gascon firebrands like Basco de Montléon. Hailing from a minor noble family, he likely fought at Poitiers in 1356. Under the Black Prince, soaking up the tactics and ransom culture that defined the war's early phase, after Bretigny's truce left him jobless, he didn't hang up his sword, he turned it on the French countryside. Froissart mentions him ambushing travelers and exhorting villages in the Ile-de-France and Champagne. I talked about this also in the video about travel in medieval France. A shout out to bigger names like Sir Robert Knowles. Sir John Emery's crews were small but vicious, favoring hit-and-run raids over grand sieges, a hallmark of the Routier's life. Emery's career peaked in the 60s of the 14th century when the free companies swelled into threats like the Grand Company at Brignais. He wasn't a headline captain there, but his presence in the post-treaty chaos, as telling chroniclers note him clashing with French garrisons and even fellow Routier, like when he and Montléon fell out over spoils in 1365. His hand is murky. Some say he died in a skirmish against Bertrand de Guesclin's cleanup crews. Others that he slipped into obscurity with his loot. Emery was wasn't a strategist like Chandos or a terror like Seguin de Badefol. He was a survivor, thriving in the war's messy fringes, a knight turned bandit with a nose for profit. Perrot de Castelbret, who was the bastard half-brother to Arnaud Amanieu, the Sieur, the Lord of Albret. He was a Gascon routier whose blood tied him to power, but whose birth barred him from it. The Albret family ruled swathes of Gascony, as you know, was one of the most important families in southern France. Later on, they also married into royalty. They were allied to England at this point, and Pertukas grew up in their shadow, likely born in as early as the 30s of the 14th century to a mistress. He fought at Poitiers and turned mercenary after Bretigny. It's a typical story here, you understand, joining the Tarvenu with Seguin de Badefol. In 1361, he ravaged Languedoc and Toulouse, torching fields and shaking down towns for pâtisses. His Gascon roots gave him an edge, local knowledge, and king like Bertucat d'Albret amplified his raids. By 1363, Pertukas was a captain in his own right, splitting from bigger bands to lead a few hundred men into Auvergne. Froissart paints him as a cunning but reckless. He once scaled a castle wall with ropes, only to lose half of his crew to a French counterattack. This was really the norm, actually, in siege warfare, in coup de main, that were very, very frequent, especially at this time in history, where actually much greater level fortification was occurring in open field as in closed field. Unlike his legitimate brother, who played politics with Edward III, Pertukas lived raw, dying around 1366, possibly poisoned alongside Seguin in Navarre, as we've seen before, or cut down in a raid. He wasn't a grand figure like John Hawkwood, but his bastard refueled a hunger that kept Gascony's war machine churning, a rogue son who turned exclusion into a blade. Then we have Eustace de Bréchicourt, a Hainaut. This is a bit different, but not too different, because from the Low Countries, as you know, many former brigands had come from, in fact, the Brabançons themselves. He was a knight who swamped chivalry for cash in France's turmoil. I talk a bit about the Low Countries in this period, very tumultuous era, very involved by proxy, especially in the 100 Years' War between France and England. Now, born around 1330, Eustace joined Edward III's retinue early, fighting at Poitiers in 1356 besides Chandos. So when you watch that video about Poitiers, remember, these are all the protagonists. Some of them we mentioned then, but some were just there. And that's what I love about Schwerpunkt, that you get all this intertwinement within the content. Bréchicourt's flair showed when he captured French nobles for ransom, banking enough to marry into the Plantagenet orbit his wife Isabelle, who was in fact the Black Prince's cousin. Post-Bretigny he didn't settle. He led free companies in Champagne and Burgundy, raiding from 1360 onwards. So you see in different regions the years are the same. With the Treaty of Bretigny, the effects are to be felt all across France. De Bréchicourt, 1362 sack of Bar-sur-Aube netted him a fortune, though it drew French ire. Eustace straddled knightly honor and Routier ruthlessness. In 1364 he fought at Cocherel for Navarre, barely escaping when the Capitale de Bouc was nabbed by D'Esclans. Back in Gascony by 1367, he joined Chandos at Nájera, then kept plundering into the 70s, defying Du Guesclin's efforts to purge Routiers. He retired rich, dying around 1373 in Carentan, leaving lands and a legacy as a gentleman brigand. Unlike Seguin's wild end, Eustace balanced profit and survival, a Hainaulter who made France his playground. And then we have Sir Peter Audley, the brother of Sir James Audley, a Poitiers standout, as we have seen. He was thus an English knight who traded on family valor to lead free companies in Gascony. Born in Staffordshire around 1330, he likely trailed James into Edward III's wars, fighting at Récy in 1346 or Poitiers. After Bretigny, with James rising as a Garter knight, Peter went rogue commanding Gascon and English routiers loyal to the Plantagenet cause. His raids in the 60s of the 14th century targeted French-held Aquitaine, reinforcing England's grip while lining his pockets. Peter's crews were tight-knit, often clashing with French garrisons or rival companies like Amerigo-Marcels. Froissart notes him holding a fort near Bordeaux in 1365, fending off a siege with archers and guilles. He lacked James' renown. Chandos overshadowed him, but his persistence kept Gascony a headache for France. He likely died in the 70s, possibly in a skirmish or quietly on his estates. Peter was no visionary. He was a soldier's soldier, wielding family ties and battlefield grit to stay afloat in a cutthroat era. Naudin de Bergerac was a Gascon captain whose obscurity belies his role in the post-Bretigny chaos. Likely born in the 1330s near Bagnères de Bigorre, he emerged after 1360 as a free company leader, raiding alongside bigger names like Perrot de Bernois. His band, perhaps a few hundred strong, hit Limousin and Périgord, extorting towns too small to resist. Froissart barely mentions him, but local records hint at a 1363 attack on Brive, where he burned mills for refusing pâtisses. Naudin's career was short and brutal. He lacked the scale of the Grand Company or the cunning of the Guesclin foes, dying around 1366, possibly in Spain, with the routiers redirected there or cut down by the French militia. He is a footnote to giants like Knowles, but his raids kept the war embers glowing in Gascony's back country, a minor player who lived fast and faded faster. Olin Barbe was a shadowy routier, likely Gascon or French, whose name surfaces in the 60s, Free Company sprawl of the 14th century. Details are scarce. Froissart and others barely note him, but he is tied to raids in Auvergne or Poitou after Bretigny. Possibly a low-born soldier, petty noble, he led a small band, hitting villages and abbeys for quick loot. His moniker, Barbe, so beard, might hint at a rugged look or a nickname earned in the field. Olim's obscurity suggests he never scaled up like Seguin or Hawkwood. He might have joined the Grand Company at Brignais in 1362 or trailed Knowles' 1370 chevauchée, but no chronicler sings his deeds. Likely dead by the 70s, or the 14th century disease, battle, or betrayal, he's a ghost of the Routier plague, a man who thrived briefly in war's cracks, leaving little but echoes of terror. Sir Robert Briquet was an English knight who turned Free Company captain, raiding northern France in the 60s of the 14th century. Born around 1330, possibly in Yorkshire, he fought at Poitiers under Chandos, learning the art of war and ransom. Post-Bretigny, he led a band of English and Gascon fighters, targeting Picardy and Normandy. Froissart credits him with a 1362 raid near Amiens, where he extorted pâtisses from merchants, burning barns when they balked. Briquet's style was direct, less finesse than Knowles, more brute force. So to say, in 1364, he clashed with French troops near Vernon, escaping with loot but losing men. He might have joined Chandos at Nájera, 1367, though records are fuzzy. By the 70s, he faded, perhaps killed by Guesclin patrols or retired to England. Briquet was no mastermind, but his raids kept French nobles scrambling, a blunt instrument of England's shadow of war. Sir Sylvester Bute was an English captain, a loyal shadow to Sir Robert Knowles, raiding France's Loire Valley in the 60s of the 14th century. Likely from Devon, born around 1335, he fought at Poitiers or Crécy, cutting his teeth under Edward III's banner. After Bretigny, he joined Knowles' Compagnie Blanche, torching towns like Orléans in 1361. His band, archers and men at arms, specialized in swift strikes, living off the land while dodging royal armies. Bute's peak came in Knowles' 1370 chevauchée, where he commanded a wing burning villages near Paris. When du Guesclin ambushed them at Pont-Verlaine, Bute slipped away, lucky than Knowles, he lost gear but kept his height. He likely died in the 70s of the 14th century, either in battle or obscurity. Bute wasn't a standalone star. He was Knowles' hammer, a reliable cog in the Routier machine that kept France bleeding. Sir Hugh Calveley, half-brother of Knowles, a prominent English knight mercenary commander during the Hundred Years' War, known for his military exploits across France, Brittany, and Castile in the 14th century, born around 1315 to 1333 in Cheshire to David de Calveley of Leah and his wife Joanna. His exact birth year remains uncertain. He emerged from a gentry family tied to Calveley Manor in Bunbury, and though his early life is obscure, he rose to fame as a soldier of fortune, blending loyal service to the English crown with the lucrative chaos of mercenary warfare. Calveley's military career kicked off in earnest during the Breton War of Succession, where he fought for the English-backed Jean de Montfort against the French-supported Charles de Blois. His knack for leading men shone at the Battle of Auray in 1364, where commanding the reserve under Sir John Chandos, he helped secure a victory for Montfort, ending the Breton conflict with the Blois' death. Earlier in the 50s, he honed his skills raiding alongside Sir Robert Knowles, a fellow Cheshire native and possibly his half-brother, though the precise familial link remains speculative. Some sources suggest Knowles may have been a cousin or uncle instead, tied through a shared regional origin rather than direct blood. Arnaud de Servolles, the archpriest, born around 1320 to minor nobility in Lot-et-Garonne, Périgord, he initially held the ecclesiastical fief of Velines as a lay archpriest, a position he lost when the Archbishop of Bordeaux expelled him for consorting with brigands, which is incredibly fascinating. Undeterred, Arnaud pivoted to a military life, quickly earning a reputation for his mastery of escalade, the art of scaling walled cities and castles with ladders. By the early 50s of the 14th century, he was leading a modest band of 80 men in southwest France, but his prominence surged after he fought under the Count of Alençon at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Wounded and captured by the English during that disastrous defeat, he secured his release through ransom and soon married Jeanne de Grasset, a wealthy widow whose fortune bolstered his ambitions. The turning point came in 1357 when the French monarchy faltered after Poitiers, and King John II's capture left the realm in disarray. Seizing the moment, Arnaud rose to command the Great Company, a sprawling coalition of free companies that swelled to 2,700 men at its peak. That year, he led this formidable force into Provence, targeting the wealthy domains of Queen Joanna I of Naples. His campaign was ruthless. Castles fell, villages burned, and his army marched towards Marseille, only to pivot when the city proved impregnable. Instead, he turned his sights on Avignon, extorting 40,000 crowns from Pope Innocent VI in 1358 to spare the papal city and withdraw. Returning to French service under the Dauphin Charles, he briefly served as Castellan of Nevers until the Peace of Bretigny in 1360 paused the war. In 1362, King John II, now freed, enlisted him to quell other free companies ravaging Burgundy, but a lack of preparation led to his capture at the Battle of Brignais. Released once more, he resumed pillaging the region until 1364, when the Count of Burgundy paid him 2,500 gold francs to depart. In 1365, the Duke of Burgundy pitched a grander vision, a crusade against the Turks, to purge France of its murdering free companies, with Arnaud at the helm of his great company. The plan unraveled amid logistical failures and his troops' reluctance, and a second attempt in 1366 collapsed under supply shortages and mutiny. On May 25, 1366, near Mahon, his own men turned on him, ending his life in a brutal betrayal. Arnaud de Servolles' career was a tumultuous blend of royal duty and outright brigandage, driven by his skill in escalade and his knack for exploiting chaos. Sir John Cresswell. is another name, but I couldn't find too much information about him. The same goes for Raymond de l'Épée, also known as Espiot. We have instead Sir Matthew Gournay. We know more about him as an English knight and soldier of fortune whose long and storied military career unfolded during the 100 Years' War spanning the 14th and the early 15th centuries. Born around 1310 in Stoke-under-Hampton, Somerset, he was the fourth son of Sir Thomas Gournay, a notorious figure implicated in Edward II's murder, and John Furneaux. His father's banishment and death in 1333 left the family's fortunes shaky, but Matthew carved his own path, rising from obscure roots to become a celebrated warrior, praised by chronicler Jean Froissart as, quote, a molt vaillant chevalier, a most valiant knight. His military life began in earnest with the naval battle of Sluis in 1340, where he fought under Edward III, helping secure a crushing English victory over the French fleet. From there, his career surged through the war's defining clashes. He stood among the ranks at Crecy in 1346, where English longbows devastated the French, and at Poitiers in 1356, witnessing the Black Prince's triumph and King John II's capture. His service wasn't confined to England's banner. Matthew's ambition drew him, in fact, into the Free Company's bands of mercenaries, thriving in the war's lulls. By 1357, he was governor of Brest Castle and Saint-Mathieu in Brittany, a post cemented with royal safe conducts, though his allegiance wavered as he joined the Grande Compagnie, raiding on their own account. This predatory streak landed him in the Tower of London in 1362, likely for unsanctioned warfare, but he rebounded swiftly. In 1364, he fought at Auray in Brittany, aiding Sir John Chandos in a victory that killed Charles de Blois and ended the Breton Succession War, capturing Bertrand du Guesclin in the process. His exploits stretched beyond France during the Castilian Civil War. He initially backed Enrique de Trastamara in 1365-6, only to switch sides when the Black Prince intervened, sharing in the triumph at Niger in 1367 alongside Sir William Beauchamp. Matthew's ties to Aragon deepened around 1371 when he bought castles from Sir Hugh Calveley, gaining lordships over Mola and Novelda with rights to Asp later recognized. Richard II even petitioned John I of Aragon in 1392-94 to uphold Matthew's claims there. From 1381 to 1382, he served as Marshal or Constable per Froissart of Edmund, Earl of Cambridge's army in Portugal, leading a hefty retinue of 480 men to bolster Fernando I against Castilian threats. Much of his later years saw him defending English interests in southwestern France, a grizzled veteran still in the fray. He lived to an extraordinary 96 years old, dying on September 26, 1406, which is really, really extraordinary, outlasting, in fact, most of his contemporaries, really to completely different eras, and we'll talk about this more openly, but you can check also out that video made about Charles IV that lived less, but still, especially in the 14th century, really witnessed a world completely changing. Buried in Stoke-under-Hampton, his legacy was the last of Somerset's. Gournay lingered in local place names like Faringdon-Gournay. Childless, his wealth amassed through ransoms, plunder, and shrewd alliances marked a life of relentless combat and shifting loyalties, a testament to the era's brutal opportunism. Sir Thomas de Grandison, 4th Baron Grandison, was an English knight and nobleman whose military career played out during the later stages of the 100 Years' War in the 14th century. Born likely in the 30s or the 40s of the same, he was the son of Oth de Grandison and Beatrice Malmen, inheriting the baronial title in 1369 upon the death of his uncle John de Grandison, the 3rd Baron and Bishop of Exeter. The Grandison family, originally from the Swiss region near Lake Neufchâtel, had risen to prominence in England through earlier generations, notably his great-uncle Sir Otto the Grandison, that we discussed, as close ally of Edward I, in fact the video dedicated to the latter. Thomas's life, though less chronicled than some contemporaries, reflects the martial vigor and shifting fortunes of his era. His military path took a significant turn in 1370 when he led an English force into northwest France, a campaign tied to Edward III's renewed war efforts after the Treaty of Bretigny unraveled. At the Château de la Faigne, near Saint-Calais, his army clashed with French forces under Bertrand du Guesclin and Olivier de Clisson. On December 4, 1370, this encounter escalated into the Battle of Pont-Valent, where Thomas served as a commander under Sir Robert Knowles. The English caught off guard by a swift French assault after a grueling march suffered a crushing defeat. Thomas was captured alongside some 80 other knights, his fate sealed by poor coordination and exhaustion. Sent to Paris as a prisoner, he faced Charles V's court on January 1st, 1371. A high-value captive whose ransom underscored his status. Despite this setback, Thomas's valor earned him distinction. In 1370, he was named a Knight of the Garter, joining the prestigious order's 21st stole, a mark of honor reflecting his standing among England's warrior elite. Married to Margaret Carew, sometimes spelled Carew, he left no children, his line ending with his death on November 1st, 1375. His tomb alongside Margaret's lies in St. Mary the Virgin Church in Newent, Gloucestershire. Their alabaster effigies a quiet testament to a life of service and strife. Thomas's career, though brief and punctuated by defeat, flowed through a turbulent age. His gartered knighthood, a lasting echo of a knight who rode boldly into war's chaos only to meet its arch realities head-on. Sir John Harleston was an English knight and military commander whose career unfolded during the latter stages of the 100 Years' War, particularly in the late 14th century. Born into a family of modest gentry from Harleston, Essex, his lineage tied to a manor once held by Richard de Harleveston. Around 1109, he rose to prominence through martial prowess and loyal service to the English crown. His exact birth year remains uncertain, likely falling in the 1340s or early 1350s, but by the 1370s he had emerged as a seasoned soldier in the ongoing Anglo-French conflict. Harleston's military life gained traction during Edward III's campaigns, though his most notable exploit came under Richard II. He fought at the Battle of Nájera in 1367, serving in the Black Prince's army during the Castilian Civil War, where English forces bolstered Pedro the Cruel against Henrique de Trastamara. This victory showcased his early battlefield mettle, but his reputation solidified in 1381 during the Peasants' Revolt. As rebels under Wat Tyler ravaged Essex and Kent, Harleston played a key role in suppressing the uprising. Chroniclers like Froissart note his valor in skirmishers near London, where he helped restore order after the rebels sacked the city and murdered Archbishop Sudbury. His efforts earned him knighthood and royal favor, cementing his status as a trusted captain. By the 1380s, Harleston's career shifted to naval and coastal defense. In 1387, he joined Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, in a fleet action against French and Castilian ships off Margate, scattering the enemy and capturing several vessels. This victory highlighted his versatility, blending land and sea warfare in an era when England's shores faced constant threat. Later, he served as captain of Calais, a critical English stronghold, likely in the late 80s of the 14th century or early 90s, overseeing its garrison during a tense truce with France. His tenure there underscored his strategic worth, though specific dates blur in the sparse records. Harleston's life wound down quietly, his death estimated around 1399 or shortly after, possibly at his Essex estate. he left no prominent heirs, and his legacy faded from major chronicles, overshadowed by flashier contemporaries like Chandos or Hawkwood. Yet his story flowed through a turbulent age, battling foreign foes, quelling domestic chaos, and guarding England's frontiers, embodying the gritty resilience of a knight who thrived in war's unrelenting churn. Sir John Hawkwood, famously enough, a very concise account of his deeds that we will again talk about much better, more in detail in another video. He was an English knight turned mercenary captain whose extraordinary military career carved a legendary path through the 100 Years' War and the tumultuous Italian wars of the 14th century. Born around 1323 in Sibyl Hedingham, Essex, to a modestly prosperous tanner and landowner, Gilbert Hawkwood, and his wife, he was the second son in a family of 7. His early years hinted at little grandeur. Local lore claims he apprenticed as tailor before war beckoned. But by his 20s he was a soldier in Edward III's armies, cutting his teeth in France. He fought at Crécy in 1346, where English longbows shattered the French, and likely at Poitiers in 1356, witnessing the Black Prince's triumph. These battles forged his skill and ambition, setting the stage for a life beyond England's shores. When the Peace of Bretigny in 1360 posed Anglo-French hostilities, Hawkwood, like many restless veterans, turned to the Free Company's bands of mercenaries roaming a fractured Europe. By 1361 he joined the White Company, a disciplined outfit of English archers and men-at-arms, and soon rose to lead it. His journey took him to Italy, a land of warring city-states ripe for a soldier's trade. In 1363 he entered Pisa's service against Florence, beginning a decades-long dance of alliances and betrayals. His tactical brilliance shone at Cascina in 1364, where he outmaneuvered Florentine forces despite a smaller army, cementing his fame. Over the next 30 years he served Milan, the papacy, Padua, and eventually Florence. His White Company, later simply Hawkwood's Company, a feared instrument of war. His signature was adaptability. At Castagnaro in 1387, fighting for Padua, he dismounted his men and used terrain to crush Verona's larger host, a masterstroke of medieval strategy. Hawkwood's life wasn't all glory. He faced setbacks, like a failed ambush near Faenza in 1375, and earned a ruthless reputation, sacking towns like Cesena in 1377 under papal orders, leaving thousands dead. Yet he balanced brutality with pragmatism, often sparing foes who paid well. His personal life intertwined with his career. Around 1377 he married Donnina Visconti, legitimate daughter of Milan's ruler Bernabo, tying him to one of Italy's most powerful dynasties. They had 4 children, including a son, John, though his English first marriage to a shadowy figure named Alice produced 2 daughters, one later wed to a German mercenary. By 1390, aged nearly 70, Hawkwood settled into Florence's employ as captain general, defending the Republic against Milanese expansion. His final years saw him knighted by Richard II, and granted estates in Essex, a nod to his roots, though he never returned. He died on March 17, 1394, in Florence, his body first buried with honors in the Duomo, where Uccello's fresco later immortalized him as a stern-mounted figure. At Richard II's request, his remains were repatriated to England, likely interred in Edingham, though the site is lost. Hawkwood's wealth, ransom spoils, Italian pay, and land marked a rags to riches tale, his name echoing as Giovanni Acuto, John the Sharp, in Italian lore. From Essex fields to Italy's bloodied plains, his career flowed through war's chaos, a mercenary titan whose cunning and courage reshaped a fractured age. Sir John Juel was an English knight and soldier whose brief but vivid military career flickered brightly during the 100 Years' War, culminating in his death at the Battle of Courchevel on May 16, 1364. Little is known of his origins. His birth date and family background remain unrecorded, but he emerged as a seasoned commander among the Routier companies, those bands of mercenaries that roamed France in the war's chaotic interludes. His name surfaces prominently in Jean Froissart's chronicles, which paint him as a bold and gallant figure, a knight who wielded both courage and skill in equal measure. Joel's moment in history came at Cocherel, near Hulbach in Normandy, where he led an English contingent within the Navarrese army under Jean de Grailly, the capital de Bourg. This force, numbering 800 to 900 knights and 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers, including Gascons, Normans, and 300 English archers, backed Charles II of Navarre's bid to seize power amid French disarray after King John II's captivity. Facing them was a French army commanded by Bertrand du Guesclin, a master of cunning who turned the day's tide. Joel, heading the 1st Battalion of men-at-arms and archers, took up a defensive hilltop position, a classic English tactic meant to shred advancing foes with arrow volleys. Froissart lauds him as the most expert among the captains, noting how he advanced sword in hand, performing, quote, many very gallant feats of arms and refusing to retreat. Yet valor met its match in strategy. Du Guesclin feigned retreat, luring Joel and his men down the hill in pursuit, an impulsive move that broke their formation. St. George, Joel cried, urging his battalion forward, eager to clash with the French. The capital followed reluctantly, and the trap snapped shut. Du Guesclin's reserve flanked them, routing the Navarrese. Amid the melee, Joel fought fiercely, sustaining grievous wounds to head and body. Captured by a Breton squire under Du Guesclin's command, he was dragged from the fray, only to succumb to his injuries before the day ended. His death marked a French victory that checked Navarre's ambitions, though Brittany's disputes lingered. Sir John Joel's tale is one of fleeting brilliance, a knight who burned bright in battle, undone by a single misstep. His life flowed through the war's brutal currents, a testament to the era's blend of chivalry and chaos preserved in Froissart's admiring, yet cautionary, words. Amerigo Marcel, also known as Amerigo Marche in Occitan, or Merigo Marche in some chronicles, was a notorious French mercenary captain, Routier, whose tumultuous career unfolded during the 100 Years' War in the late 14th century. Born around 1360 near the borders of Limousin and Auvergne, he hailed from the modest Château de Beaudeduis, a hunting lodge for leagues from Limoges, held in fealty to the Bishop of Limoges by his father, a minor local lord. His early life took a martial turn at the age of 10 when his father handed him over to Sir Thomas de Roux, an English aligned knight who trained him for 3 years. Later he served under Sir Gussier Helias, another Englishman, igniting his lifelong allegiance to the English cause in a fractured France. By the 80s of the 14th century, Amerigo had risen to infamy as a leader of the Free Company's bands of roving soldiers, thriving in the war's chaos. His exploits fill 4 chapters of Jean Froissart's Chroniques, painting him as a cunning and ruthless figure. He seized the Château de Carlat in Haute-Auvergne, selling it to the English, and later captured the impregnable Château de la Roche-Vendée by stealth, leaving its defense to his uncle Guyot d'Ussel while seeking English aid. His raids terrorized the countryside, Auvergne, Limousin, and beyond, amassing wealth through plunder and extortion. One daring escapade saw him and 12 companions take the Château d'Aloise near Saint-Flour. Spotting the lone porter lounging outside, Amerigo ordered a Breton crossbowman to shoot him dead, then stormed the undefended fortress, ejecting the porter's grieving widow after securing its keys. His luck faltered in 1390. After a truce between France and England, which he swore to uphold under penalty of death, Amerigo resumed his pillaging, prompting outraged locals to appeal to Charles VI, King of France. The king dispatched Robert de Bethune, Count of Meaux with 400 lances and 120 crossbowmen to crush him. Holed up in La Roche-Vendée, Amerigo slipped out to rally English support, but returned to find the castle lost. Seeking refuge with his cousin, Tournemine, he was betrayed. His kinsmen, pressured by the Duke of Berry, arrested him. Hauled through the country, he reached Paris, where, despite offering 60,000 francs for ransom, the crown spurned his gold. Judged a traitor, he faced a grim end on a market day at Les Halles. Paraded in a cart spun on the pillory as his crimes were read, then beheaded and quartered, his execution a public spectacle meant to deter others. Amerigo Marcel's life flowed from a squire's training to a brigand's dominion, his name synonymous with the era's lawless opportunism. Froissart captures the Duke of Berry's right relief at his capture. Amerigo Marcel is caught, his cousin Tournemine holds him, and the knight's grim verdict, no pardon, only the gibbet. His tail step in betrayal and bloodshed mirrors the Free Company's fleeting power snuffed out as royal authority, clawed back control, which is also the ultimate narrative of the matter we will have to insist on, especially in other videos about the Kingdom of France as a whole. Sir James Piper is another name that we do not know too much about, telling the truth. Then we have Sir James Planchamp, also pretty much informationless to some degree. Bernadette de la Salle, we know a bit more about this guy, often referred to as Bernardon de la Salle, or simply Bernard de la Salle in historical records. He was a French mercenary captain whose exploit during the 100 Years' War left a mark in the chronicles of Jean Froissart. Born around the mid-14th century, likely in Gascony or a neighboring region, his early life remains shadowy, typical of many routiers who rose from obscurity to notoriety. He entered the martial scene in 1359, serving under Jean de Grilly, the Captal de Bouc, a prominent Gascon noble aligned with the English. On November the 18th of that year, Bernadette showcased his daring by scaling the walls of Clermont-en-Beauvaisis, with steel grappling hooks, seizing the castle in a bold night assault, a feat that signaled his skill in escalade and set the tone for his career. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which posed the war between England and France, left Bernadette and his men jobless, a common plight for soldiers of fortune. Unwilling to fade into peace, he joined the ranks of the Parvenus, latecomers to the war's plunder, forming one of some 30 bandit companies that roamed France, pillaging towns and extorting villages. By 1368, he was still active, operating alongside captains like Bérard d'Albret, Gaillard de la Motte, Bernard d'Aoust, and Bourg de Badefol, a loose coalition of Routier exploiting the countryside's chaos. His most audacious act came in 1369 when, with Bernard de Visque and Ortingo de la Salle, possibly a kinsman, he captured Belperche Castle in Brittany. The stronghold housed Isabella of Valois, Duchess of Bourbon, making it a high-stakes prize. The trio's triumph was short-lived, though. The castle soon faced a siege by the combined forces of the Dukes of Bourbon and Burgundy, though Bernadette's fate in that clash isn't detailed. Bernadette de la Salle's career flowed through the war's lawless undercurrents, a mercenary and bound by loyalty to save profit and survival. Froissart's accounts cast him as a figure of both prowess and peril, a man whose steel grabs and sharp wits carved a path through a fractured realm. His story likely ended as many routiers did, swallowed by the violence he wielded, whether in battle, betrayal, or obscurity, leaving no clear record of his death. His life, a whirlwind of raids and ransoms, mirrors the era's brutal opportunism, a Gascon blade flashing briefly amid the 100 Years' War's long shadow. We have Cerceau, Jacques de Querelle, but unfortunately, the knowledge about these figures at point is so sketchy that there isn't even a proper biography to outline with certainty. We just have the names in chronicles, and then we mostly appreciate them for the context that they enrich rather than the protagonism that they express. But definitely they did contribute themselves in that way, just not to a level is adequately documented. And unfortunately, that's sort of the main issue. Nevertheless, I think that these videos on the free companies that I made, there is the first part of this video, and then a recent one just randomly from the cycle that talked about very similar things, if anything, the latter part of it, especially the way these companies were eventually framed in the permanent cores that were forming around Europe's most powerful states in France and Italy. Nevertheless, that's important because we talked about mercenaries fairly a lot, and at least this year, last year we did something more than the usual. It's not even, that I don't like the concept of mercenary warfare per se, because there is some kind of, in my opinion, like political distortion in the idea we intend mercenarism, which is valid and important, of course, in history, but that is mostly a politological than a military issue, at least in the practice of warfare when you really analyze it. So, just for the record, I was glad about, especially having talked about the things per se, because we never really addressed this chapter, especially for France in the 100 Years' War. Instead, we have 37 pictures that I think are fairly well illustrating great part the stuff we have seen also in other eras, etc. So it's really a comprehensive version of the wall. For today, however, stop it here. We'll keep talking about free companies. I just hope that you enjoyed, for now, this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.